Hello, Megan.
Hi, Daniel.
Are we supposed to be introducing ourselves? Is this the standard operating procedure now for blogging heads?
I guess, actually, I think it would be more interesting if we introduced each other. I'm here talking to Daniel Drezner, the brilliant, handsome, and extremely talented professor of public policy at the
Professor of International Politics.
Fletcher School of International Politics, which I always screw up, at Tufts.
Yes, and I am talking to Tina Fey's secret, long-lost, much taller twin, Megan McArdle, the smartest female econoblogger over 6 feet tall at The Atlantic.
Would you like to make that a little more specific? It's like baseball statistics.
Who wears glasses, yes. And is Irish. How about that? Of Irish descent.
I think I'm well specified. This is like Tyler Cowen's theory that we should come up with alternate status hierarchies that we can be at the top of. I think you found mine.
There we go. So we're here today to talk about why I'm bitter, or at least to start off with. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Why are you bitter, Dan?
Well, there's so many reasons. Right now it's raining outside. It's just crappy weather up here.
Yeah, here too. I fled a World Bank luncheon. Basically, I just stood outside until a cab pulled up out of charity in front of the building.
Oh, is that bad out there as well?
Yeah, it's the balcony outside my office is flooding.
Oh, good Lord. Okay. Well, let me know if you need to, if FEMA, suddenly is outside your door and you need to evacuate. But,
yeah, if you hear a big swooshing sound and my voice cuts off, you'll know why.
Okay. If I hear you doing a heck of a job, then I know what's going on. So wait, you posted something last week in response to Arnold Kling about why you think academics are bitter.
Indeed.
Do you want to review quickly what you think the reasons are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the academic job market is possibly the most bitter, the most brutal job market in the world. It's one of those things where you get, kids who really like being in school. And
yes.
A lot of them decide to go to grad school because they like being in college, and grad school often isn't like college. And then after they've put in sort of 5 years getting their PhD, they then enter upon this unbelievable job path where, it's entirely binary. Either you get a tenure-track job and get tenure, and your life is great. And if you don't get tenure, your life is terrible. And there's almost nothing in between. And part of the vicissitudes of that job search means that you don't really have any control over where you live. You don't have terrible enough control about what you teach. And so the price, and also you get paid a lot less than what you would have gotten paid if you put in those 5 years doing something besides teaching. And I think all of those things, I actually know grad students who said that people wouldn't go out with them because they're like, look, I don't want to do a joint job search. So I don't date grad students.
It's not you, it's your job search.
Exactly. That may just be the kind way of grad students letting people down. I don't know.
No. My wife did this. When we were on the job market, we still have this. There's a map that she made of the United States, and she actually, using a color-coded four-color pen, she drew in the places she was willing to move to and the places where there was no chance in hell she was going to follow me.
Well, one of my favorite English professors at Penn was one of the top guys from Berkeley, which is the top school in the field, or was in the 90s anyway. He applied 40 places, got one job offer at Penn, stayed there, and then didn't get tenure. He's now at the University of the Pacific. So I just think that whole situation, the lack of control, and the fact that often academics end up in places where it's totally insular, you're totally locked in to the university because there's nothing else in the town. There's no other people in the town who sort of share your interests or so forth if you're in a small college town. And then the last thing I think is that I am always amazed by how finely grained status distinctions are in academia and how easily people, academics I know walk into a room and they can sort of name the rank of everyone in that room in their profession from top to bottom. And
now,
that's got to
be... I got to push you on this, because I don't disagree with that assessment in the sense that academics are highly status conscious, but Megan, you're living in a town where it's a one-industry town where it strikes me everyone is status conscious about how much power they have or influence they have vis-a-vis everyone else. I mean, wouldn't you say that's true about Washington?
Oh, no, I think that's definitely true, but there's multiple hierarchies to be in, right? You can be the top of the journalism hierarchy, or you can be in the top of the the government hierarchy or the think tank hierarchy or so forth. And like in academia, it's basically like, are you the top guy in your field or are you not? And I think that's just brutal, like to have that like sort of laid all out to you. It's just so, everyone's so conscious of like exactly what university they're at, exactly. And I think that I think it's the academic labor market is not good for academics. I think it's, you know, and once you get somewhere, if you're a journalist and you're sort of lower down in the status hierarchy, you can say to yourself, well, you know, it's just, I'm just working here and eventually I'm going to get another job at a better publication. And that's not, like, if you're a tenure track professor at a third tier university, you're never going anywhere unless you have like a really amazing stroke of luck.
I'm not entirely sure that's true. I mean, you know, first of all, you got to realize that academia, you know, it breaks down a lot by discipline. I mean, it matters a great deal what discipline you're in, and most importantly, what the private market is for your services.
Yes.
So, you know, if you're an economics professor, it's a very different world than if you're, let's say, a Romance language professor.
Yeah, and I think that for economists, lawyers, engineers, certain kinds of physicists, scientists, biologists, and chemists, I think that it is really different.
Right.
Because they always...
I would categorize all the people for whom there is a viable outside sector as falling within the non-bidder category because they have a better exit option than
right.
a lot of other people. I'm in between in a lot of ways because in political science there isn't exactly an outside market, but there is kind of. I mean, there's a think tank community, there are foundations, there's government, there is something out there that you could potentially do, but it's not nearly as big in terms of private sector stuff.
Right.
The second thing is that I think academic mobility is a little bigger than you're potentially giving them credit for, which is if you know, the job market is, and I wrote an article about this for Political Science about 10 years ago where the signal rule that I said that you had to learn was this is a capricious process. I said there were 6 commandments to the job market, and 3 of them were this is a capricious process. It's a capricious process when you go through it. Globally, the system is a little more rational. So if you wind up at a third-tier university, but you continue to actually produce decent scholarship, usually that's a decent chance then that you're going to get hired by another place. The real problem there is that the way the job market works often is that it's a process by which if you screw up and you wind up, you know, off your preferred decision tree, you're correct that it is very tough to move up. If, for example, you get a job where your teaching load is what's called 4-4, meaning you're expected to teach 4 courses per semester for both semesters, it is fantastically difficult to write the articles that can potentially move you up.
Right.
So you're correct there. That's one problem. Second problem is that, you know, even before that, let's assume you don't get the tenure track job. Let's assume you get the adjunct or visiting position. That's often difficult. I mean, that's a ghetto that's incredibly hard to break out of.
Yeah, you know, I think like when I had a weird situation when I graduated from business school. I got laid off by a management consulting company just as the next crop of MBAs was coming out of the job market.
Yeah.
And the thing is that even though they know it's capricious, and even though they know you didn't do anything, they sort of think, well, why take the chance when I could have someone who didn't get laid off at all? And I think that's, you know, people know that it's possible to end up in the adjunct pool even though you're talented, but, you know, why risk it?
Well, I mean, that's not exactly how, I mean, being on the hiring side, you don't look at someone and say, they're an adjunct. We shouldn't hire them because they'll have that dirty adjunct smell and they'll, you know, they'll get the virus on us. It's not quite like that. It's that you recognize that it's tough to, you're still going to look basically at the scholarly output. If they publish interesting stuff, then you're still willing to take a look at them. The problem is, it is much more difficult to do that from an adjunct or visiting position. But I think the reason that there is occasionally some bitterness in the academy, and I think it's a little less bitter than you're characterizing it, is not so much the economics of it, but rather the sociology of it, which is anyone who goes to graduate school and gets a PhD. The fascinating thing about graduate school is that it actually conditions people to not go for the money. Which is, it's assumed that your job, the way that you will determine your success, is not by, in fact, let's say, going to the job that pays the most amount of money, but rather going to the job that's considered most prestigious.
Right.
So to give you an example, I mean, the year I went out on the market, I had a colleague who went out on the market, got a tenure track offer from a research university, a serious research university, but wound up instead going to a consulting firm. The reason the person went to the consulting firm was because of spousal issues, and easily the person made, I'd say, 5 to 6 times multiple of what the person would have made going to the university. And yet, this friend of mine felt like a complete failure in that the person let down the advisor in some way.
Right.
And it's amazing that that's the sort of indoctrination that you can get going through grad school. The belief that if you somehow take a job with less, that earns more money, but it's not like your top-tier research university, that's somehow seen as failing. And so I think one of the results of this is that a lot of people who get PhDs are believe so strongly in the life of the mind, and that, this is what we are supposed to be trained to do, that if we get something that's not exactly what we expected, we tend to get a little bitter.
Well, I also think that's a big part of the problem, right? Is the way grad school is set up, it selects for people who are in some senses risk averse because tenure is attractive to some people, but also it selects for people who are incredibly single-minded. To get through grad school and write a dissertation in a reasonable period of time and not be one of those people who's just kind of hanging around for 8 years trying to finish requires...
I gotta tell you, in some places 8 years is not considered too long, but I take your point. Yeah, go on.
Well, it depends on the discipline and...
Yeah.
But to not be that, to actually finish in a reasonable amount of time and get a good project and so forth, you have to be incredibly single-minded.
Obsessive-compulsive is the word I would use, yes.
Yes. You're usually not the kind of person who also has, a rich hobby as a sailor or something. You've focused on this and you've given up a huge amount. And so the outcome, you tend to judge everything about your life on where you fell.
I would disagree with you, which is that in my experience, the people who wind up going to get a PhD are obsessive-compulsive about the PhD. They're not only obsessive-compulsive about that, though. They're also obsessive-compulsive about whatever hobby they choose to have as well. So I'm not quite sure.
Okay, I will. I defer to your superior wisdom.
It's more the personality type. The real problem is the following. I mean, academia is aware of this, and in fact, during the 90s, you saw in a lot of programs this sort of dramatic reduction of the number of people admitted into graduate school because there was a recognition that we couldn't, that the university system couldn't hire all these people afterwards. And a lot of people say, well, why don't you tell incoming graduate students that there's no job out there for them, or that the job market is incredibly tough. At least, and by job market, we're talking about the really good jobs, the tenure track jobs that lead to tenure.
Right.
That it's a nice lifestyle if you can get it. And the reason is because anyone who gets into graduate school, if let's say you put them all in a room and you had them stand up and say, look to your left, look to your right. One of the three of you, only one of the three of you is going to get a job, at a tenure, at a good research university once you're done with this. Every single person in that room thinks they're going to be the one.
They've all been the brightest kid in the class.
They've always been. Yeah, you don't get a PhD unless you've been very, very good at school up to that point. Right. And unfortunately, very often you don't know whether or not you've got the chops for it until you're halfway through. And, I mean, you think that academics are bitter? That's nothing compared to the people who drop out of a PhD program. I mean, there's that famous Matt Groening cartoon, the Life is Hell one, that says, meet the bitterest person in the world, which is the PhD dropout.
Or the person who sort of slaved away in journalism for 15 years and never really got anywhere and then found themselves unemployable at the age of 40.
Right.
I think that there's a huge... I'm also in a profession that's filled with obsessive-compulsive, smartest kids in the class.
Right.
And there's a similar... But it's more mobile. It's more fluid, and it's less clear that, if you're... if you're the Metro reporter at the Washington Post, or you're the defense guy at the New Republic, who's on top there? It's not quite so clear cut, I think.
Well, I would also say there are ways in which your causal mechanisms through which bitterness is created can be diluted. First of all, you're right. You always want to be the top person in your field. But as we just talked about at the beginning of this, you can define your field as narrowly as you want, potentially. So there's often, you go by field, then by subfield, then by sub-subfield. And you can do it in such a way that you can still think of yourself as, I am the top person at X, no matter how narrow X is.
Right.
And this is part of, this is division of labor, sort of the specialization that's taking place within the academy. The other thing I would push you on is that as someone who's been denied tenure, I I agree that it is not the most fun process in the world. On the other hand, it also is not the end of the world, in that it is possible for people who get denied tenure to get decent jobs elsewhere. In fact, this is one of the great paradoxes I always find about people who talk about, oh, you academics, why, you're in your ivory tower, why don't you ever engage in the real world? The grand irony about this is that faculty salaries, academic salaries, are a completely real-world process, which is our value is almost entirely determined by whether or not we can get an outside offer from somewhere else.
No, I actually think, I think it's the opposite. I think that the academic job market is the harshest job market, I think, really in the country. It really is the sort of the binary outcomes and the tunnel vision and how much you have to do to get there, and that there's these points, right, where you don't get tenure and someone just says no.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen at a career usually in it actually does. It happens in investment banking and consulting, and to lawyers. So it does happen in some.
I actually think it is more prevalent in. I mean, it happens in the military also. I mean, it's up or out for a lot of these places. So I mean, I'm not entirely sure that's true. And before you ennoble us academics with, oh God, we suffer so much. I mean, I have the best job in the world. It's really
no.
awesome.
Actually, I do. I'm gonna have to push back on that, Dan.
I mean, I always feel guilty about this, but yeah, I mean, I think the thing I like about being a professor is, I know far too many of my colleagues that really love what they do and would probably do it for a pittance or a fraction of what they're actually paid. I think the peculiarities of these job markets that we're talking about is precisely because there are so many people who want to do it, but in order to pay people a living wage, or it's a guild system, so therefore the salaries are, while not as much as you would earn, let's say, in iBanking, are still decent middle-class wages. They're therefore coveted, but only a fraction of them get them.
Although I actually think that in the case of, there's something different about academia and journalism, which has the same kind of salary problem that academia does, is investment banking and consulting and working in a big corporate law firm, I venture to say almost no one actually wants to do those things, as an end in itself. They want to do them because consulting a little less, but investment banking or being a corporate lawyer is just incredibly boring detail work. It's like you're the world's most highly paid clerk.
Yeah.
And so people want to go into those fields precisely because they pay so much. Whereas, people want to go into... I remember when I got offered my first job at The Economist, and I hadn't heard anything from them for, 2 months, and because I've got this really slow hiring process. And finally, the guy who I'd interviewed with called me and said, hello, this is Aunt Gottlieb. And I said, oh, hi. And he said, how are you? I didn't really know what to say. It was kind of awkward. And he was like, well, actually, I'm planning to offer you the job. And I said, I'll take it. And then he was sort of taken aback, and he was like, well, and, we were thinking of paying you. And I was like, oh, you're going to pay me? That's even better.
Wow, you were really a shrewd bargainer, Megan.
I was. I did not help myself on the salary negotiations. We didn't have any salary negotiations, right? But I think those kinds of jobs, those are the jobs that you and I have. The thing where it's nice that they pay us to do this, but we would do this as a hobby even if they didn't.
Well,
or something like that.
I would be. I'm going to demand a little bit in return, but yes, I mean you're right. It's a great job, and I think that in some ways, it is because there is an ideal type in which if you get to this. Look, I'm a professor at a pretty decent university, and if you get to that level, it's a great thing. But it's a dramatically fierce winnowing process to get to that stage, and so you're correct about that. On the other hand, I just say in my experience, there are some bitter academics, but I'm not sure as a percentage of the total profession, it's in any more bitter place than a lot of other places, in part because even if you're, in a geographic locale that you don't like, if you like the work you're doing, for someone who does something involving the life of the mind, that's 90% of living. So it depends. And the other thing is that I think people, when they take jobs in geographically undesirable locales, generally will do it at the beginning stages of their career, which means they're willing to put up with a lot more. You're right that over time, if they can't get out, then that might pose some problems. But on the other hand, often places that you would not initially think are desirable to live in turn out to have some rather big charms. So maybe that also cuts against it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I guess I go to conferences with academics and so forth, and given their level of sort of that they are living the life of the mind, which they all say, think is important and valuable and interesting, they're unhappier than I would expect them to be. They're unhappier than like other corporate lawyers are about that unhappy. But the corporate lawyers stop being unhappy when they stop being corporate lawyers. And that is just what I wonder, like why this phenomenon exists, that compared to the other professions, the people in other professions that I meet, they just seem more unhappy than people of similar achievement in other fields.
It could be selection effects, which is you're only meeting people at conferences. And these
Quite
are large
possibly
scale.
true.
If these are large scale conferences, there's a lot to be annoyed at large scale conferences, But
yes, after the airline has lost your luggage, the entire world seems like
yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of academics and tenure,
yes.
John Yoo. This has been the controversy of the month for you and me.
Well, not me. I mean, I haven't really blogged about it, but for you, was that a pun? That's the worst pun ever. Oh God. All right. So yeah, there's been a bunch of sort of debate in the blogosphere. Boys of Crooked Timber, Brad DeLong, Jack Balkin. I'm not sure if the Vlog people have weighed in, but basically arguing that that John Yoo, because of the memos that he wrote when he was in the Office of Legal Counsel, basically authorizing the executive branch to do, essentially anything it wanted, saying the Commander-in-Chief had the authority to engage in acts that we would consider torture. Wrote memos that were then pulled by the later head of the Office of Legal Counsel and had generally been described as being somewhat shoddy in terms of their construction and so forth. And now there's this movement afoot to fire him, basically, from Berkeley.
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
I've
Hi,
actually... child coming to visit?
My child is coming in to say hi, but...
No. Daddy's on TV right now.
I'm on TV. You want to make a quick cameo appearance? Come here, Lolly.
Oh.
Sorry, yes.
I wish I could see her.
Before I defend, John Yoo, I can very quickly brag about my daughter. So hold on. Lolly, look at the camera. Whoop. Can you see yourself?
Yeah.
Can you say hi?
Hi.
Can you say
Hi.
I love you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, can you say bye?
Bye.
Okay. You got to get going now, okay?
Bye.
I can't wait to
Bye-bye.
see this actually on TV. So
What'd you say?
I can't wait to actually see this because we
That's
can't
pretty
see
cute.
each other.
Come on.
Bye-bye.
Bye to Daddy. Bye.
I love you. Have a good day.
Come on.
Sorry about that. All right. So, what is John Yoo and whether or not he should be fired? This leads to some interesting debates about whether or not what you did, intersects with academic freedom. In other words, and whether or not you deserves to be protected for doing things that essentially provided the legal infrastructure for allowing torture. So, what is your take on this?
Well, I'm against tenure. I know this is not a position that is popular with any academic I've ever met. But I actually think that it goes back to this brutal binary winnowing process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it just creates problems. It sorts for the risk averse, and it creates sort of really bad incentives and bad structural problems in universities that I think are sort of difficult to. And I just think in general, in every other labor market, if you have an employee who can't be fired, you pretty much know what to expect from that employee.
Well, all right, but first of all, let's be clear. The tenure system does not mean that someone can't be fired. It just means that the grounds for their firing are pretty clear-cut, which is, essentially in most places it's if you plagiarize, you can get fired. If you molest, harass students, you can be fired. If you fail to teach or, do other, your academic responsibilities, you can be fired. So, it's not quite that clear-cut.
Right.
What it means is that you're no longer... if you mail it in terms of the teaching, or you don't decide not to publish anymore, do any sorts of these things, the tenure system protects you. There's no question about that. Although I have to say, again, on the academic side of things, what strikes me is how low a percentage of people who get tenure then decide, oh, well, I can just mail it in now. It's actually startling. I mean, again, and this goes back to the sort of socialization within academia, which is most people who are good enough to get tenure are also, driven enough to ignore the fact that they've got tenure and continue to publish and continue to be as productive as possible as they can in terms of scholarship.
I guess I would say too, though, that to me, I look at Berkeley, and why should Berkeley have to continue to be associated with John Yoo if they don't want to be? I'm certainly not arguing that tenure is sort of the problem with the American university or anything, but I think that
Well, all right, wait. Let's go back to the question about being associated with John Yoo. Let's say John Yoo didn't write the torture memo, but rather John Yoo wrote a Foucauldian analysis of the 9/11 attacks and determined that, in fact, the people inside the World Trade Center were, because of their role in the productive power of the capitalist system, implicitly responsible for imperial U.S. foreign policy and therefore deserve to die.
It's basically the Ward Churchill argument, right?
Slightly
less.
Actually, that was a more
I think he didn't put it that well.
But let me. I think I was improvement on the Ward Churchill argument.
Yeah.
Let's say he made that argument. Surely, Berkeley wouldn't want to be associated with that either. But are you saying that he should be fired for that?
I guess I question whether the value of, because I think there's a cost, right? Which is, on the one hand, the cost is, I wonder if the cost isn't that it contributes to a lot of fields, again, fields where there's no outside options, becoming in a lot of ways more insular and more talking to each other, right? English is the classic example of this. It's not possible now to be even someone who has read a huge amount of literary criticism and books. You still can't read what an English professor produces. They're all producing, a couple hundred books for a few hundred other people who can understand what they're talking about. But that doesn't work in Yu's case. I mean, he's a lawyer, for Pete's sake. God knows there's an outside market for what he does. No. I think that's true. I just wonder if the cost of tenure isn't, on the one hand, the benefit is that you can say things that are extreme. On the other hand, the cost is that you can say things that don't matter, because once your university has hired you, you can just sort of decide that you want to spend the rest of your life just thinking about what snails and Dickens means.
All right, I will give an economic defense of this, but I want to talk more about you, given that once we assume tenure exists, then whether or not it applies to you. But here's the rationale you can provide. I don't necessarily disagree with what you're saying in terms of specialization leading to people writing for an audience of, let's say, 100 or 200. But let's say also that usually about 1 out of every 1,000 academic articles that is produced is actually an article that has significant impact in the sense of not just the article, which is cited everywhere, but it actually leads to a trickle-down effect in terms of contribution to the world of ideas or innovation or what have you. In some ways, what the tenure system, the system sets up is not, might not necessarily be defensible from the perspective of an individual academic, but as a system, what it allows is that it guarantees that enough people are going to be trying to produce scholarship such that you're more likely to get that 1 out of 1,000 breakthrough piece.
Right.
Which, if you didn't have the system, you would not have that, because the likelihood that it would be produced would be lower, and therefore you wouldn't have as much contributions to knowledge. So think of it as a lottery system.
Okay, although I wonder, the quality, wouldn't the top one be the most likely one to be produced when you had, a really cool, interesting idea that people...
It's a capricious process, Megan. You don't know that.
Yes, I've never published an article in an academic journal, so I happily defer to you. But assuming that tenure is in place and that I am wrong and tenure is awesome and we should have it,
right?
What do you think about John Yoo?
I mean, my instinct is to say he should not be. I mean, first of all, I'm assuming that the people who are calling for John Yoo to be fired are not actually calling for Chris Edley, who's the dean, to walk into Yoo's office right now and say you're fired, but rather to start a process by which they investigate whether he should be fired.
Right.
Because just to say fire him for something where he's committed he hasn't been charged with any crime yet, and the, evaluation of his legal services to the government remains a matter of some dispute. That's a hell of a, there are no grounds on which you presumably can fire him for. But But whether or not you want to start a process where you say what he's done merits the removal of tenure, I think I'm coming down not reluctantly, I'm coming down on the side of he shouldn't be fired. Because this is exactly one of those cases where it's a tough test. What he said is remarkably unpopular and remarkably controversial and put towards the services of government that, did to some extent, engage in horrific acts as a result. On the other hand, I don't think John Yoo did this because he was trying to please the government or because he was trying to, ingratiate himself. He did this because he actually believes in it. And he's published articles to that effect in law journals. So it's not like he sort of came up with this out of the blue. So I'm unpersuaded by the arguments that he should be fired. I think there are other ways, frankly, that you can deal with the John Yoo situation, which is it's perfectly appropriate, I think, for other lawyers and critics of John Yoo to publish books, articles, what have you, saying, wow, this John Yoo doesn't know what the hell he's talking about when it comes to this issue. And in some ways, precisely because of the reasons you talked before about how academics view their own status, that's the better way to punish him, in my opinion, which is to make his arguments discredited. That's the better way to deal with it. I don't think firing him, I don't think a line was crossed that requires him to be fired.
Well, I think you've got this problem. I mean, first of all, that it's not clear to me what the quality of the scholarship was.
Yeah.
And I have no way at all to evaluate that. So
I think it's a difference between the quality of the scholarship and the quality of the actual memos he wrote. Right. My understanding is the quality of the memos he wrote were not that great at all. That, in fact, it's very rare that a Office of Legal Counsel retracts a memo, a memo that it had previously issued, and so.
But if he'd written it on anything else, Berkeley is not going to fire him because he wrote a crappy memo on EPA legislation.
Well, I guess it depends on what the effects are. I mean, part of what this is what the memo was used towards. And the memo was provided the legal justification for, basically the treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo, the treatment of prisoners in Iraq. That's pretty serious. So, and generally, even conservative legal commentators have generally not said all that, many great things about Yu's, the way you drafted these memos. The way they were drafted were incredibly poor.
Well, here's a question. I actually don't know the answer to this.
Okay, I might not know either, but go ahead.
What would happen to a history professor who, having gotten tenure, started denying the Holocaust? And not having given signs of this before, but started writing books saying that the Holocaust didn't happen or it wasn't as bad, or...
He would not be,
Would his tenure be revoked?
No, not a chance. Let me put it this way. Tenure would not be revoked unless he wrote an article where he just flat out lied. In other words, if he tried to make the argument based on evidence or what have you, even if it's a crappy argument, if he abided by the rules of scholarship, no, he wouldn't be fired. In fact, that's exactly why presumably you'd want academic freedom in the first place. It's worth remembering the reason academic freedom, the origins of academic freedom, and Louis Menand talks about this in the Metaphysical Club, was a Stanford professor that Jane Stanford wanted to fire. Because this professor was a history professor, had incredibly bigoted views, I believe, about Asians, about Japanese immigrants into California, and he, the American Association of University Professors got together and developed this guideline of academic freedom to protect this bigot, arguing that what he articulated met the standards of scholarship at the time. I'm not sure what they were, but the point is that
they can't have been very high, but.
No, but the point is that the origins of academic freedom were based on someone's views that would today be considered so odious that it would meet with public calumny if they were to say those views publicly now.
Well, I think that then, right, if you're not going to pull someone's history tenure for denying the Holocaust, which is stupid, right? At a fundamental level, it's just. It's a specious. Let's stipulate that it is a specious, stupid argument that he would be making, and therefore would require him to be doing shoddy scholarship.
Well, even better, someone who this is an issue. Someone who let's say someone who argued that the 9/11 attacks were the work of the Mossad.
Right. Would that IR scholar be fired?
No, I don't think so. Again, it depends on how they did it. If they just sort of said, obviously this is the case and, falsified evidence or what have you, then yeah, that would be grounds for being fired. If, on the other hand, they said it and they made an argument using whatever evidence they could rely on, no, there's no way you'd fire that person.
Then I don't think you can pull John Yoo's tenure.
That's my, as I said, that's my opinion. And it's worth pointing out, this is exactly what you have academic freedom for. It's precisely the cases where every, fiber of your being says, this person is repellent, and I want them shit-canned. But, in fact, the point is that that's exactly where you need academic freedom, I think.
Right.
I guess that's my take on it.
So, who are the professors who think he should be fired?
I think Brad DeLong has made a series of arguments saying that John Yoo has violated legal ethics in the drafting of the memos, and therefore, as a violation of, as an ethics violation, that justifies him being fired because he engaged in professional misconduct. I think some others have argued that because he's teaching, some have argued that what is the lesson of John Yoo, writing memos, saying the president, saying the U.S. can engage in essentially torture and not get fired. What is the signal that sends to the law students? That it sends a bad signal. I think some others have.
I think if you could get him disbarred, if the ABA was a better forum for that. If you get him disbarred,
and also, I would say the ABA is a better forum. The irony is that I was trying to read up on stuff about academic freedom, and I came across, some of the reactions when David Horowitz, came out with his book, The 100 Most Dangerous Professors in America. And, you've got the same people who I'm sure are calling to fire John Yoo now, decrying Horowitz for, engaging in McCarthyite tactics. It strikes me that if you, as I said in the outset, if you really want to punish John Yoo on this, the way to do it is not to go after his job. The way to do it is to publish showing how John Yoo, engaged in the most reckless form of scholarship you can do, and, was just flat out wrong. The way to destroy him is not to fire him; it's to destroy his ideas. The professional ethics, that's a more interesting question. But this is where I'm sort of at the limits of my own expertise in terms of what Yoo was obligated to do as an agent of the U.S. government. And this is probably where a political scientist might come down slightly differently than a lawyer. One of the arguments that they're making is that the canon of legal ethics requires that you be, provide his employer with, a full briefing of legal precedent and so on and so forth. The political scientist is not entirely shocked that the Office of Legal Counsel would produce an opinion that the executive branch would be pretty sympathetic with, that they would have wanted in the first place.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to fly. You can't. I mean, if you could get him disbarred, go to the ABA. They're the people who adjudicate legal ethics, not the university.
Right.
And the fact is, I am sure you could pull many government memos that were at least as bad as that memo, written by sort of people who are now famous law professors, because in fact people phone it in, or they write things that the administration wants to do, or they have an idea that they're pushing that they don't have great evidence for.
I think my personal favorite it was in Woodward and Bernstein's The Final Days, about Nixon's last days. I think that I'm pretty sure that someone either at the Department of Justice or in the White House counsel's office had come to the conclusion that Nixon, if he had resigned, was allowed to pardon himself.
Wow.
Exactly. If you think about that, that's a stunning, legal opinion that I don't think anyone would accept now. But at that point, there were some lawyers for Nixon who believed, that in fact the president was allowed to pardon himself before resigning. Which, say what you will about John Yoo, I don't think he was suggesting that. So, it does show that lawyers, to some extent, you're right. I mean, agents of the executive branch, when tasked by someone, by their political superior to do something, will often do it and stretch, whatever the canon of ethics governing their profession is. I mean, that's just the way it works, unfortunately.
Well, but I also think that, in some sense, the essence of what it is to be a lawyer is to argue for your side, is to leave the facts that are inconvenient out of evidence and not consider them. And so pointing out that a lawyer didn't, include all the facts is sort of redundant in a way.
Well, this is where hopefully there will be some lawyers who watch this who can actually tell us what what legal you're bound to do by legal ethics, because I don't want to speculate about what are they bound to do, what do they expect to do, and when can you occasionally, skirt these things. I mean, the point, so I agree that I think trying to fire him is not the right route to go, that instead trying to take it to the ABA or other professional bodies, that strikes me as a more appropriate way to discredit his ideas.
Right. And just make his life, I mean, there's also, you can make his life a living hell in the sense of, shunning him, if that's the appropriate thing to do.
If you want to do that, yes. But this raises another question, which is, you've been embroiled in a dispute with a couple of other bloggers about war and torture.
Yes.
Do you want to give, sort of a summary? Because there's a whole series of
blog posts. It's a long, I mean, part of it is that, I'm sort of interested in, small moral questions in a way that I don't think other people are. So I pick up on these small moral questions. They're not small moral questions, actually, to me, but they're side debates to something that most people are really interested in arguing about, which is just how evil is the United States. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of interested in looking at sort of boundary cases. And things like World War II, I think, is really good, not because what happened in World War II justifies what we do now, but it's right. Because... then in World War II, it's really easy just to discuss the question of, now that 99% of us agree that this war was good and that we should have done it, okay, now let's talk about what it was legitimate to do within the scope of that. And so, this started a while back, right? This started when Glenn Greenwald basically said that the media was dropping the ball on John Yoo, and it was because we were all fatuous and so forth. And we actually had a Blogging Heads about this a little while ago. Yes. And you and I responded, and he responded angrily, and accused us both of defending torture. And he then went and dragged up something that I wrote in 2003, which is legitimate to drag up, but I also think he didn't, he sort of quoted it out of context. The entire post was, and actually I have to say that I'm not sure that I would write what I wrote then now. I don't think I feel the same way about it that I did. It was actually 2002, not 2003. I don't think that I feel the same way about it. I was in New York on 9/11, and I was very angry. I lost a lot of people in the towers. But even that said, I was 100% against torture as U.S. policy. Again, almost what I was looking at is what's the boundary case? Right. If someone kidnapped my mother, and I had the guy who did it in front of me, can I really say that I would just, no, torture's wrong, it's too bad my mother's going to die, but I can't do that. That's a really hard case. If it was your kid, if somebody kidnapped your kid and you had the guy there, and would you...
This is the 24 scenario, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
But, the fact is that when we don't torture, right, it's someone's kid, it's someone's mother.
Right.
And, the ultimate thing that I said, though, is that as state policy, that I think you have to consider that. And what I was trying to say is that the people who are supporting this, that's what they're considering. They're thinking of Americans whose lives they want to save. They're not just doing this because they're hateful, evil people. I think that they're ultimately supporting a hateful and evil act that should not be supported. But that, step back and just understand that they're not doing this for the sheer joy of it. They're just thinking about the American victim, not the person that, and as state policy, I think it's terrible, a terrible idea. You should never give the government the power to torture, ever. What I say, if there's a nuclear bomb in Manhattan and you have the guy and you could get the information out by torturing him, would I say, no, you shouldn't do that and you should let 1 million people be incinerated? Probably not. But at the same time, I don't think that you need a special policy for that. If that is actually true, then the agents will do it.
Yeah, I think lawyers have actually made a decent point here, which is just because you're outlawing torture doesn't mean it won't necessarily happen in that scenario. In that scenario, someone probably is going to torture the person to find out where the bomb is. If they get the information, it prevents, 1 million people from being died. And then that person should probably be prosecuted. That's in some
exactly,
way.
And that was the point that I made, is that ultimately, then there have to be penalties. This person has to pay because they should only do it when they're willing to go to jail.
Exactly.
When it's so important that they would be willing to go to prison and lose their career, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so that was, it was a very sort of vague, and then that, this then got into a question about what causes war crimes, because then Greenwald had talked about like wars of aggression or aggressive wars.
Right, and your point was that any war will lead to these kinds of incidents.
Whether it is an aggressive war or a defensive war is just not relevant, right? Mm-hmm. We firebombed Dresden, which was worse than the Blitz.
No, in fact, I would actually argue Glenn's got it in reverse, that in some ways defensive wars probably lead to greater atrocities, in part because you believe that because you didn't start the war, you believe you have the right on your side.
Exactly.
And so if the Nazis invade you, you will justify anything and everything to combat them.
But I also think that by the time you get to the point where these things happen, because in the beginning days of almost any war, they're as gentle as wars get. The beginning part is always the nicest part. Like there's the famous in World War I, the famous armistice on Christmas Day when the Germans and the British met and sort of toasted each other,
right,
and had a ceasefire. Well, that didn't happen in 1915. By then they'd been shooting at each other for a year, and there was no possibility of that. And things did get worse and worse as World War I went on. Mm-hmm. Similarly, World War II, the things that happened in the war got worse. What we did to the Japanese towards the end was worse than what we did in the beginning because everyone had lost friends to these guys. So you have POWs sort of boiling their skulls ripping the gold teeth out of Japanese people who are still living and then killing them. You have terrible things happening in the Pacific, and the command, as far as I know, sort of saying you can't do that in rear areas, but we're not going to pay attention to what you're doing.
Although it is interesting to note that in that case, the war on terror is actually probably unique because my guess is whatever atrocities have been committed were probably more severe at the beginning stage and have lessened over time.
Well, but we don't have a tit for tat. We're not trading blows, right? At this point,
the most horrific act was also the first one. Exactly,
and we're not getting on our soil hit again.
Yeah.
I would say that in some ways they're escalating over there, right? They certainly did in the first phases of the Iraq War, right? Mm-hmm. It escalated and the violence got worse and worse.
Right.
But at any rate, like the point I was making was only that aggressive wars are not the reason you get war crimes. War is the reason that you get war crimes. And there's reasons you don't have to... I mean, in some sense, yes, war crimes are inevitable. Any war that you have that goes on for more than, 3 days is going to involve at least one atrocity. But
although, I do think Andrew Sullivan he responded to you at one point, and I think his argument was there's a difference between war crimes that happen and war crimes that are, to some extent, an instrument of policy.
Oh, right. No, but that's the thing. Is I wasn't... I think I was actually specifically... I don't think I wrote the post very well, unfortunately.
Okay.
But I think that that's true. The Bush administration made administrative choices that were extremely bad.
Right.
But they didn't have to make those administrative choices because we had invaded Iraq, and they could have made those administrative choices if Iraq had invaded us. And you can say that maybe there's some link between the kind of person who invades a country and the kind of person who makes who authorizes these tactics. Although even there, I think that you have a solid point, which is that people who are fighting what they feel to be a defensive war, the closer they feel to that, the more likely they are to authorize bad things. But merely that, but I think that we got Dresden not because the Germans started it. We got Dresden because of the Blitz, and because of the things that had happened in between the Germans starting it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we got into, one of Andrew Sullivan's readers sort of emailed in with a defense of Dresden as a strategic choice, which I think is specious. The people who authorized this in the Bush administration thought that they were doing, I don't want to say a good thing. They were doing it for a strategic reason. They were doing it because they thought they could get information, right? They weren't just doing this because... They like to beat up Arabs.
No, they thought it was absolutely necessary. I mean, one of the things I get, I've talked to Jack Goldsmith about this. He wrote The Terror Presidency. One of the things he stresses about, explaining why the Bush administration wound up doing what they're doing is you had to understand their mindset post 9/11, which is they kept getting this intel, and unfortunately, I think it was raw intel. And this is a case where I actually think the president, the decision makers were given too much information that was unreliable. But basically, they were told about any possible threat. It was called the threat matrix. And so the result was that if you get bombarded with that information, you feel you have to do everything within your power to prevent it. Even if it means stretching the law or distorting the law to the point where it's not recognizable anymore.
I mean, I think the thing that is actually clear to me is that the Bush administration really believes that this expansion of state power is good. It isn't about them. It really is about they think the executive should have this power regardless of who. I don't know which is more frightening to me, actually.
Well, no, in some sense, it's the scarier fact. They weren't doing this cynically. They were doing this because they genuinely believed it to be true.
Right.
And in some ways, that's much harder to counteract. Because if they were doing it cynically, then you could change the political realities and they'll actually stop doing it. The problem is these people haven't stopped doing it because they genuinely believe it's the right thing to do.
So, I mean, what is it costing us? Because you're the IR scholar. What is this policy, aside from just the fact that we're doing something evil?
Sorry, we were slightly interrupted by technical difficulties. When we last left off, what were we talking about, Megan?
Well, I was asking what does this cost us? I mean, aside from the fact that we're doing something really evil, what has the torture stuff cost us in terms of foreign policy?
It's cost us a fair amount, I think, because one way to think about it is this notion of soft power, which people like Joseph Nye and others have talked about, which is the desirability, the extent to which other countries want what we want. In part, that's determined by whether or not we're perceived as a successful or virtuous country. And to be sure, the fact that we're now engaging in torture kind of tarnishes that a fair amount. Now, I don't know if that's permanent tarnish. I think that if the next president comes in and announces changes in these kinds of policies, that will lead that could potentially erase some of this. But to date, the basic problem in terms of practical foreign policy implications is that Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib and what have you provide a giant blanket excuse for any country out there to say we do not recognize the United States as the moral arbiter of any sort of sets of values in the world because you all torture, and second, it provides any leader that needs some sort of popular base to not comply with or not cooperate with the United States because they can say I'm not going to do this. My population can't stand you because you guys torture. So it's not. There's no way I'm doing it. It's. I'm not sure. It's basically an all-purpose blanket excuse.
And even when the governments in question are worse than us, it's just they have an once you've given them the excuse, no matter how hypocritical they're being, it still plays with their base. Yeah, and it should be pointed out that one of the interesting things that's going to happen starting in 2009 is that presumably the next president, again, regardless of who they are, is going to probably take or eliminate aspects of these policies that are deemed most objectionable by other countries. This does not mean it should be stressed that these other countries are suddenly going to cooperate with us on a whole bunch of stuff. But it does eliminate one excuse. And it's going to be, in some ways, the behavior of the U.S. has been remarkably comforting to a whole set of other countries that don't want to cooperate with us regardless of the merits and now have this excuse. I think once the excuse is lifted, it might persuade some countries to change their policies, but there's going to be a whole other category that never wanted to cooperate with us to begin with, and now have to simply provide another justification. Right. I've always been skeptical of this notion that we can get anything we want by setting an awesome example. They're not our children. We're not raising other countries, and there's just a limit. So I think it's easier just to argue, don't give people the excuse and don't do things that are wrong. Right. That's the thing, which is it makes it so much easier. It's not like not torturing means it's all going to be sweetness and light, but it makes foreign policy that much more difficult. There's a whole variety. As a deontological perspective, you shouldn't do it anyway. But if you want a pragmatic response, it kills us in a whole variety of ways. And it doesn't seem to be producing all that much actionable intelligence, from what I understand. Although I don't know how you know that. This is one of those things where I have a modicum of sympathy for the Bush administration, where potentially they simply can't say whether or not it's worked or not. Right. Now that said, I really, really doubt that it has. And furthermore, I particularly doubt that it has now, because it's not clear to me how many. If you've captured someone in 2001. In Afghanistan in the fall of 2001, it's not clear to me how whatever information you garner from them 6 years, 7 years later is really going to be operational, useful intelligence. I mean, the related question is, what do you do? I mean, I have some sympathy for the Bush administration on Guantanamo. On this, just to this extent, is what do you do with people who are declared combatants of a government that doesn't exist, but also hasn't given up fighting you?
No, that's, and you know, there is an interesting question of how do you try these people, or, you know, do you prosecute them and what have you. I mean, I've seen arguments put forward. I think Jack Goldsmith and someone else has argued for a national security court, which would have somewhat relaxed, you know, I mean, it doesn't have full constitutional protections, but would have some constitutional protections as a way in which you could prosecute, but still provide, you know, the defense to you know, defense lawyers to actually, you know, do their jobs and so on and so forth. This is not an easy question to answer, and again, not a lawyer, so it's not.
But I actually think that I'm pretty annoyed that question, no one's trying to answer it. Like, it's just basically, you've got two sides shouting at each other, one saying Geneva Conventions and the other saying terrorism. And they're just shouting those two words over and over and over again. And there is a real question. How do you deal with a situation that the Geneva Conventions weren't really set up to handle? You know, what should you do going forward with non-state actors who have something like an army? Well, and it doesn't even seem like anyone, you know, like, it's being addressed in academic circles, but it doesn't seem like this has made it very far into the public consciousness.
No, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I mean, once you have a new again, this is all going to come up in 2009, because once you have someone who wants to change the current system, the question is going to be, well, what system are you going to create in its place? Because you're not going to send everyone from Guantanamo home. I don't even think, you know, the head of the ACLU would suggest that. The question is, what do you do with the people that you keep? And that's a very naughty question.
So we have a couple more issues to speed through.
Yes.
Public discourse, what you can and can't say. Would you care to start this one off?
Well, I was just struck by, I mean, this is something, Matt Iglesias had a post, linking to a YouTube clip where Tom Friedman, New York Times columnist, author of The Lexus and the Olive Tree and The World is Flat, got pied at Brown University. He was going to give some kind of talk at Brown University, and you know, two guys went up and nailed him with pies. And this is sort of a increasing trend, I guess. And what struck me was that Matt thought it was pretty funny, which, when I watched it, funny was not the word that came to mind. I don't really have a lot of love for Tom Friedman. I mean, I love critiquing him on the blog and in actual academic scholarship as well. But all I felt was sympathy for him. And furthermore, it's not clear to me what this kind of thing is supposed to do, except make people who don't like Friedman feel good about themselves.
Well, you know, I think there is a difference between being 55 and being 25.
Uh-huh.
And like a 25-year-old, that's sort of within when they just graduated from college and people did stuff like that to each other. So you're kind of expecting it isn't the right word. But, I mean, I think Tom Friedman was terrified because there were these strangers rushing at him.
No, I mean, it was actually horrific. You're right. I mean, if you actually look at the video, I mean, it seems clear. I mean, he's genuinely scared, and I can't blame him, because suddenly he's got two young guys suddenly going right at him. And, you know, I mean, they were pieing, which is not, again, I don't approve of it, but I can understand him being freaked out by that.
Right, and when you're in college, that sort of thing just doesn't seem that freaky. I had a friend in grad school who used to go bowling for people. Mm-hmm. He would get a running start in this auditorium that we had at Chicago, and he would then just slide across the floor and knock over 3 or 4 of our friends, and everyone thought this was hilarious.
Right, but he wasn't doing that when the 3 or 4 friends were giving a talk in front of, let's say, 100 or 200 other people.
Right, he wasn't doing it to a stranger, and he was also doing it to young, fit people who aren't afraid of getting hurt.
Right. I guess my point is, clearly the people who were pieing Friedman were trying to, in some ways, make a statement. I think they were trying to, depuff him or sort of discredit him or make him look silly. It's just not clear to me that this sort of thing actually works. And furthermore, if anything, is counterproductive.
Yeah, I don't understand what the point of it is either. It's sort of like the message it sends is that you don't like Thomas Friedman, but it seems to me that there are many better ways to send that message.
Yeah.
And it made him a figure of sympathy for most people who watched that. I think I think kids who watched it thought it was funny, and anyone over the age of 30 who watched it thought that it was really kind of pathetic.
Those kids today. So in other words, you think this is an age thing? You think that if people people who are college age who watched that would not feel any sympathy towards Friedman, but rather think, "Oh, dude, that is so awesome."
Yeah, I
Okay.
do actually. I mean, that's a guess. I'm not really in touch with what those young people are doing now, but thinking back to the dark ages, back when I was in school. I mean, of course, we hadn't invented pi yet, but but similar things with mud. I think I would have thought that was
and
fun.
dirt.
Yes.
I see. I don't know. I disagree. Maybe I at least I'm not hip to the young people, but I do have to teach them. So. I'm exposed a little bit more. And one of the things that I was intrigued by in the video is that you can tell the audience was just shocked by this and actually started booing the people who threw the pies. Now, admittedly, presumably if they're going to hear Tom Friedman speak, it means they think he's worth listening
Right.
to. So the question becomes whether or not the people outside the auditorium, also would have thought it was funny.
I guess let me put it a different way.
Okay.
I think that among college students, there would be argument about whether this was funny or not. I don't think for anyone over the age of 30, there's really much of an argument over whether this was appropriate and funny.
Okay.
Throwing things at people is not a good way to communicate with them or anyone else. There are better ways to send your message.
I mean, I do. It's interesting. I hadn't thought about the notion that if you're in college, that because this is done to you, you don't see any problem with it being done to someone who's going to give a talk. I guess the question is, I get this is a recent trend. Do you see this as an example of, for lack of a better way of putting it, the coarsening of public debate, or is this just college students being college students, and now you got video cameras showing them doing it?
Well, I'll tell you what, I've been feeling for the last sort of 3 months, at least, longer probably, but I think it's sort of crystallized for me this month, is how tired I am of talking about this election, not because I think the issues aren't important or so forth, but because no one wants to talk about the issues, right?
Yeah.
No matter what I say on my blog, and no matter what people say on other people say on their blogs, it's just about the tribe, right? Either you're supposed to be playing for one team or the other, and people are coming in to if you write something that's doesn't agree with what their team message is, they're going to argue with you pointlessly. And all they're interested in is whether does this make my guy look good or my guy look bad, not whether it's true, not whether. And it's getting worse and worse. And it's all people want to do now is fight. They don't want to talk. They don't want to actually discuss anything. Or I feel like this is becoming more and more true.
No, you might be right.
No one is interested in a discussion. All they are interested in, and I think about this with some of my more angry commenters. I posted a recipe, and people came in and started making fun of my recipe.
What was the recipe
And I
for?
thought, first of all, I just had this moment where I was like, oh my God, these are grown men. These are grown men who are sitting in their bedroom on a Saturday afternoon thinking, well, I'll get her. I'm going to make fun of her recipe.
What was it a recipe for?
It was for asparagus and mushroom pasta with tofu. It's actually quite a tasty recipe, but that's neither here nor there.
Yes,
it could have been the worst recipe in the world.
Tasty.
It actually, it has the consistency and flavor in pasta of cold mozzarella.
Okay.
But I won't try to sell you on the benefits of tofu.
Don't sell me, but you're right. I mean, yes.
The main thing is, people, and there's also the thing of when people say anything now, right? The other side immediately looks for the worst possible interpretation of it.
Right.
So that they can write scathing things about it, even when the person who wrote the original thing was writing in good faith, in the sense of trying to have an actual discussion, even if they're wrong. The people look for ways to portray anyone who disagrees with them as evil, and it's like they want to be angry all the time, and I don't get that. Even if you think there are a lot of reasons to be angry, you don't need to go looking for more, which is what so many people on the web are doing right now, and it mystifies me. But I think that the Thomas Friedman thing is a part of that. It's a part of people just withdrawing into these camps that are sitting around and whipping each other up into the belief that they should be furious at everyone in the entire world all the time and demonstrate that in any way possible.
Well, I would say, all right, two things on this. The first is, I do think you're correct that the particular nature of the presidential campaign is causing people to do this. I mean, I hosted a conference here about 10 days ago on policy planning, and I had a bipartisan group of people showing up. There were people representing the Obama camp, the Clinton camp, the McCain camp, and then a lot of former policymakers and so on and so forth. And what was interesting was, talking to the students afterwards, the thing that they were surprised about was how civil everyone was to each other. And then I think they were, because of the campaign, they were expecting. It's not that people didn't agree on everything; they agreed on some things, but the disagreements were civil and even, God forbid, productive. In terms of delineating where there were delineating what exactly the arguments were about. And I think that they were so used to what the standard debate style had been that they were actually surprised that there was a conversation going on. So I guess that would, sort of confirm to some extent what you're talking about. The second thing that I think is interesting, and this is something that's fascinating to me about sort of the Netroots group, particularly, on the left, but certainly mirrored by those on the right. But one of the things that fascinates me about the Netroots is their sneaking admiration for people like Karl Rove and people who have sort of been Bush's political Svengalis and the right's political Svengalis for creating this whole machine of think tanks and columnists and commentators and so on and so forth. And the belief, not that what they are doing is evil, or they do believe it's evil, but their response to this is not, we need to have improved discourse, because I think in their minds this got their ass kicked for 20 years. Rather, what they want is to create the left version of this. And that therefore, you've got equal force in that sense. And then they can engage in the exact same tactics, which, for those of us who are, not going to be in the employ of either, ideological extreme, find somewhat distasteful.
Yeah, and just the constant, the politics of personal destruction. And I'm not trying to say that, Jeremiah Wright doesn't matter at all, or that a lot of these things don't matter, but they don't matter to the extent to which they're being blown up. They don't, that people are sort of harping on anything that makes the other guy look bad. Mm-hmm. And I just, why? Is this really what we want to run our presidential campaign about? About whether Barack Obama made a political decision to go to a church that a lot of black people like, which is basically what it comes down to.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I will say this. I think one of the tests for this is going to be whether or not the campaign discourse improves once the Democratic situation is settled. I think part of the reason this has been particularly sour is that it's a three-cornered fight in which two of the corners have been going after Obama. And it's gotten, pretty ugly to some extent. I think, whether it's Obama or Clinton, once a Democratic nominee has been better defined, it'll be interesting to see then whether or not the cross-party discourse will improve or not. Because I think partly what's going on is the uncertainty of the Democratic situation is causing people that were already in a bad mood to get in an even worse mood.
Yeah, I'd say that's about right.
And particularly in D.C., I mean, you probably know this better than I, but my understanding is that there are a lot of people in D.C. who are basically on edge at this point because their future jobs, again, you want to talk about uncertainty, we go all, we're finally going full circle back to the academy. These people who desperately want jobs in the next administration, whether or not they're going to get them, crucially depends upon who is actually elected president. And the uncertainty about who is going to be the nominee just, it's got to be. I mean, I remember when I was there in 2000, when in the fall, there were people who could have been Undersecretary of State or were going to have to stay in a think tank, and that matters a great deal to them. And were just incredibly on edge the entire time, during which Florida was being recounted.
I think that that's true, but I also think that there's a thing in D.C., because it is one of the very few cities left in the country that have both Republicans and Democrats who have to get along with each other, is that you also see a fair amount of, when you watch The Wire and the guys start going, you shot my friend, but, it's all in the game. And there's a little bit of that, is that there's less actual moral outrage about things that happen on the other side and more understanding of, the underlying mechanics of it and sort of a respect for the fact that, yes, your opponent is going to try to get his people elected. Whereas outside of D.C., there seems to be, genuine indignation that the other candidate is daring to campaign.
Right.
And who the hell does he think he is? So, yeah, I will be glad when this election is over and everything is settled one way or the other. My mother is the swing voter. Her vote keeps predicting the presidential election, so I'm desperately quizzing her, trying to figure out who is the nominee, but we don't know yet. And I will agree with you. D.C. is incredibly unsettled. I'm thinking about buying a house, and everyone's telling me, by this summer, because come January it's going to be a disaster.
That's when everyone moves in. Well, speaking of torture, I'm hearing screaming from the rest of my house, which means that my wife, I think, needs help in terms of, dealing with the children. So I'm afraid we're going to have to sign off.
Okay, well, I wouldn't want to keep you on edge.
Yes.
Thanks for talking, Dan. And
Always a pleasure.
as always, it was a pleasure. And hopefully I will get to talk to you again soon.
All right, take care.